Prepare to be educated.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Eric.
And I'm Ty.
And we are ShantottoCast.
Back at it again with a new episode, and sadly, it's also our last.
Yeah.
I've been watching a lot of anime recently, and I've decided to tackle and make the rest of my life's work on the gray areas of being isekai'd. I'm going to start touring. I'm going to pursue a master's, and then I'm going to try to get isekai'd myself to explain to the people in the isekai why this is a moral gray area and why it shouldn't run in modern media. I'm going to create a 3-hour-long video called Isekai is Garbage, and here's why.
Okay. Noble venture. Yeah. Good luck.
Anyway. Have I mentioned that Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced, a game where you get isekai, is my favorite RPG of all time?
Yeah, you have.
Sorry.
In fact.
Sorry.
You in fact
so,
have.
While I struggle with that, with anime becoming largely
with Ty being gone, you guys are going to need to know how to build good decks on your own.
Yes. While I struggle with my inner conflict about isekais, you guys are struggling building decks, and we're here to help.
Yep. You guys know that we do Fix It Fridays, and we love doing those. We love not only building decks, but we love interacting with people. And, I loosely say our fans, because I wouldn't argue that we're big enough at all to have like true fans. We have a couple of like real hardcore listeners and people that we hang around, but
we don't exactly have groupies.
I was gonna say we don't have groupies, so and clingers. So, but we're willing to give away some of the secrets of how we do Fix It Fridays. But you know what? We'll take the hit for you. Because we like you guys. And I swear we're not shady salesmen. Yeah. Quick aside, that is a common sales tactic. Pretend you're giving the person a deal at your own expense to seem more like benevolent or generous. And that convinces the customer to trust you and, feel like you're on their side.
They also try to do that in police interrogations.
Yeah.
But thankfully, we're not the police. And less thankfully, we're not shady salesmen yet.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And next thing you know, we're going to be plugging Curiosity Stream. But
you're being shills for Dislight or Raid Shadow Legends,
Raycons,
or Manscaped.
Oh god, Manscaped. I'm not gonna lie. If we do see that email that says that they'll pay our rent for a while, I'll consider it. But anyway, back on topic. So. There's a lot of factors going into a deck. There's a lot of things that we generally bring into making a deck. Mind you, we're not the best players in the world. We can hold our own in locals. But from all the deck lists that we've read, from the people that we've interacted with, from the thought processes that we've gone through with you guys, with our locals, with each other, we've kind of figured out generally how to build a deck.
We're able to give good feedback to some of our better players, and we've had people that go to some of our Nats level players occasionally ask for input, and we're like, here's our input, and the fact that they even ask for our input is meaningful enough, I think.
Yeah, but before I'm gonna start with a meta tip on how to improve your deck. Feel free to ask, or always ask for constructive criticism.
Yes.
Always ask other people's opinions. You don't always have to change your deck just to fit what they think your deck should be, but you should consider it. Because a big thing that I will see is that people will have a pet deck that they don't want to change, or there's a reason they don't want to take that card out, or they really, really like that character in the games, but they want to play this deck competitively. There's concessions that you're going to have to make when you build a deck.
Yeah, you can't marry an idea.
Yeah. And you should take valid criticism on your deck if you need it, especially if you want to play competitively. I think most of our tips are going to be mainly for trying to play competitively or trying to make the most optimized version of that deck, as well as how to start building a deck. But if there's any piece of advice I could give anybody that's meta, is always listen to constructive criticism on your deck and seek criticism on your deck.
Yeah. Don't take criticism as a personal attack. It is just, you know, it's just input on how to improve your deck's function. Nobody's insulting you by saying, I don't think this card's working for you. Like, you know, they're not telling you, hey, you're going bald and you look like shit.
Yeah. To be fair, it seems the first time you hear it, it seems condescending when someone says, why are you running this? But as someone who's asked that question a lot and a person who's been asked that question a lot, like, trust me when I say that, like, leads to a whole door of, oh, now I get to, like, actually think about why I'm actually running this card. And there's been times where I've explained why, and the person will just say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then we'll move on. But, like, you know, my point is, like, don't be insulted if someone says, why are you running that?
Yeah, but definitely not.
Yeah. But anyway, to go into actually putting the cards together, do you want to start with our first one?
Yeah. So this is one that I usually enjoy, a point that is how I start maybe half my decks. And the idea is build with a goal or a theme in mind. It doesn't necessarily mean build around a specific card, but it's possible that might help. And once you have your centerpiece picked, whether it's a card or a concept or a mechanic, it's time to see what if anything, works well to enable, buff, or share that card's that card or concept's strengths. So, you know, in the case of, let's say, picking a card or cards that you want to build around, the world is your oyster. I mean, we have nearly 2,000 cards in this game to work with, and some that are being played with, that have been played with recently, or much, like, you know, in the last couple years, or even in the last year, we have stuff like the Primal Rama. We have Necron. I don't recommend doing that, by the way. It's fun, but it's really slow. Prish. Just any
your
Prish in general.
Really fun.
Yeah, it was goofy. It was bad, but it was funny. Multicolor Sophie, the
that
original
one's a bit
Sophie.
more on the meta side, but like,
Oh,
I was going to say that deck really kind of showed that, like, we're going to get more into, like, archetypes, etc. But, like, there were certain cards that you could completely build around, and the deck, and because you built around that card, because that card is so strong and is getting so much support, that deck just, like, takes off. Sophie being the big one where you saw early monks take off with Sophie, and then there was Sophie Doga, and you could argue that Doga deck was more focused on Doga, but, like, that's another card that they just built around.
Yeah, definitely. And you also have the Light Rain from Opus 8, I think.
Opus 8. That was before.
I think it was Opus 8. Yeah. And I built a deck around that card. It's not a good deck, but I was able to board wipe tie with it brutally. And I lost anyway, but man, did it feel good to pull off that board wipe. And then, of course, you have the Baralai Guido combo, which got Guido taken from worst card in the game to best card in the game to banned
straight
and
into
irrelevant
the ban list.
In like a it's like, you know, someone rises from the streets to be king of a nation, and then within a week the people are like, we love you, but your taxes are too high, so they just throw him into the they throw him into the meat grinder.
He went from a peasant to a king who had it all to a king whose peasants wanted his head up on a wall.
Nice. Did you come up with that on your own, or is that a quote?
Stole it from a Hobo Johnson's.
Nice.
Please don't judge me for listening to Hobo Johnson.
Respect. But yeah, and then moving on to picking a theme or mechanics to work with, there's stuff like haste and aggro, dull and freeze, making the opponent discard, damaging yourself to get to certain damage thresholds, flooding the field, which kind of fits into the aggro thing, kind of not. It depends on how you play it. Bouncing from field to hand, or bouncing or recurring cards from break zone to hand. You could also do something like having just a few forwards that are very hard to overcome or remove. And then you also have board wipes, like frequent board wipes. And those are all common themes that people use to build decks. They're not the only ones, obviously. But
sorry, I was gonna say, don't feel like you have to lock yourself into one of them. Like Ice largely has been a good mix of dull, freeze, and making the opponent discard. And then, like, obviously Sky Pirates is a good mix of bouncing and flooding the field, as well as like a few big forwards that are hard to kill or like very value forwards. Another theme I think worth mentioning is just like getting like raw value in drawing cards. We saw a lot of when mono water really took off. That was a lot of mono water is just I'm doing better than you. Like Layla Vikings was the reason why that deck was so good, even though it was putting out weak forwards, is that you were drawing so many cards that like you always had a full grip.
Yep, exactly. A death grip, sure. You could say.
We're just drawing all the music references today.
Yeah, right? But then moving on to another category here, we have specific title or archetypes to build around. It basically guarantees you synergy or similar synergistic effects. So in terms of titles, you can pick a series to build around, and you don't have to make every single card in this deck from that particular title or series, but it really helps that you could easily convert these to title format if you wanted to do that. So it's kind of a multifaceted deck in that way, which is really nice because then you get to play 2 formats with the same deck if you like it enough. And it's a cheap conversion usually. But then the final point here is archetypes, which are basically just jobs that are shared by a lot of different cards in the deck, and that gives them advantages based on card effects. So we have some notable ones that you've probably heard of if you're, even if you're just joining the game. We have stuff like Sky Pirates, Monks, Dragoons, Samurai, Ninjas, Knights, Chocobos, and there's a lot more than that we already did an episode on. So if you want to look at that, we'll link that episode in the description. And you can check out that episode and hear us ramble about a bunch of archetypes, which the budgets for may not be accurate anymore because some of them blew up and got popular again.
But yeah.
So Ty, if you want to take care of the next point on this. On this list.
When it comes to I'm going to reword this one a little bit. So we said make sure you have at least one win condition. I'm going to kind of rephrase it to make sure you have a plan to win. So some decks have like amazing synergy, but like have no means of pushing it towards to like clinching a game. So like make sure that your deck has something that you want to focus on that will win you the game. So for example, if I just build a whole deck that just has a bunch of summons to dull and freeze my opponent's forwards, like I don't have a way to win the game off of that. Like I just need to I have no way of dealing my opponent 7 points of damage. I just have to hope that they mill out before I do. But if you build a deck that has a lot of that, but you're running a lot of cards that kill something if it's dull, or, oh, this gets haste if the opponent has dull cards, like that's going to be a way to just like push for game. You don't want a deck that can just spin the tires a lot, but not go anywhere. You want your deck to have a plan of attack to make sure that you can win the game. Because we have seen some control decks where, it really feels like the whole point of the deck is to just like mill yourself out or just kind of lose. And it's very easy to just like turn that into a mill strategy or just a hardcore control strategy. But you need to have a way to win. Like think of all the ways that this deck can win and how you want to win while you're putting the deck together. At the same time, don't have too many win conditions. Like you don't want to stretch yourself too thin because you don't want to think like, oh, if like I want to win with self burn, but at the same time I want to mill them out, and at the same time I want to, make the opponent discard a bunch. Like you have to usually select like one main way of winning and then a backup way of winning as you approach your deck. Yeah,
I can't add too much to that other than reiterating, make sure your win condition isn't too difficult to achieve, because that's always like I one of those things that we ask is always like, okay, what's your win condition? And someone will say whatever, and be like, half the time it's like, that's really hard to get to happen. Like that's, I don't want to call it a pipe dream, but like that is definitely asking for a lot of things to line up. You can't just assume the stars are going to bend to your will and line up when you say, line up, right? They're not gonna do that. So
I think a good example of this is like a lot of people want to win with 9-drop Sin, but the thing is you can't just throw that in as just a win condition. You can't just have it as like a backup plan. Like that's like there's so many ways that you have to build around it. But the thing is like if you build your entire deck around winning with Sin and then Sin dies, then you're just kind of out of luck. Like you need to have, as you put it, you need to have something there outside of just that big one. And you have to think about it.
Yeah, definitely. And to get to that point, I think. Cool if I move on?
Yep.
We good?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to tackle the next point here, which is the mana slash CP curve. And this is something that's prevalent in almost every single card game that has costs to play of some kind. And so what this means is building your deck so that you slowly ramp up in terms of cost of cards that you play onto the field. It takes a lot of optimization to make a deck work if it has only high cost or low cost cards because of how, the balance of their existence or presence on the field will be. But basically what this means is that you get what you pay for. So you start off pretty cheap, right? 1 and 2 costs early game. And then late game, you want to be able to play big stuff and little stuff at your own discretion. I see a lot of decks out there. They're like, I'm going to play all this good stuff. And it's like 1, 2 drop forward, and then just a bunch of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cost forwards. And their backups are like 1, 2 drop, and then like 6 or 7 4 drops, and then, 2 Star Sybils, a Shantotto, a Tyro, and then I don't know, throw in a bunch of other
utility backups,
high cost
Althea
backup utility
there,
backups. And it's you need to have a balance. You have to have think of it like look at an actual ramp, right? It has an actual realistic normal curve, so that if you're trying to push something, like you push something up it, right? Like go on a skateboard, it's not a sharp angle that just goes, up and then cuts to like cuts by an extra 60, 70 degrees and then just goes up in a different direction. It slowly changes its direction as you go up, going from one 90-degree angle all the way, bending up to the next 90-degree angle. So yeah, it basically, count, don't skip numbers, and make sure you have a relatively even or fair amount of each number. And this kind of goes into also the average CP cost, which is actually very conveniently calculated by ffdecks.com when you're building a deck. It tells you on the edge of the screen your average CP cost based on what it adds up from your deck. And it doesn't factor in things getting cheaper by effects or whatever, or free plays or whatnot. But it's something you want to keep in mind and keep as low as possible for as long as possible. Like, obviously, you're going to need to have those boss monster type cards, but, don't go too crazy putting in all the boss monsters.
Yeah. To hop off of this point a little bit, or rather to hop off what you said, a big issue that I had when I built my early Ice Earth decks is that I would run a lot of 4 and 5 drops. So I would have an incredibly slow early game where I was just trying to play backups. And I was only running 2 or 3 2-drop backups, and then the rest were 3 and 4 drops. So I usually had to overpay turn 1. I needed to wait till I hit 3, 4 backups before I could start playing stuff efficiently. And it was, to put it lightly, a slog.
Yeah. You lost to aggro a lot.
Yeah, that's the thing is if my opponent played even somewhat aggressively, unless I had a Shantotto on, I basically needed a Shantotto turn 4, I'd lose. So I don't think it's pertinent to just force yourself to run 2 drops. You should be thinking overall will I have enough backups to play these? How many backups do I want to have by turn 3, turn 4, and am I running enough backups to be able to do that? Yeah, and we are seeing a lot of cards that can help with curve. For example, 4-drop Sarah searches you a 1-drop backup, which is incredibly nice, helps you curve out super nice.
Yep.
We're seeing more and more cards that can search backups. Norsh Talon is another one that comes to mind, because you don't super mind paying 4 for it if you're adding a 3-drop that you could play next turn. It's you have to be very mindful of that. Don't just throw in a bunch of really good backups that are high cost. You have to make sure that you can get there, and think about your turn 1 play and playing your backups on turn 1.
Yeah, I am in agreement there. Not much to add beyond that. So I think we can both tackle the next point.
Because I also want to add a little asterisk to this next point.
I was just about to say we can asterisk this one a bit more.
So the next tip is try to keep your deck into 1 to 2 colors unless a third color is easily used or cheated out. So the asterisk that I want to add to this is if you're new, try to keep your deck to 1 to 2 colors.
Yeah.
Most decks are fine in just 2 colors. A lot of meta decks have been just 2 colors. However, and even just 1 color, we've seen Mono Fire do extremely well. We've seen Mono Ice do extremely well. And then you could take a deck like Storm, which is entirely Ice Wind, does extremely well. And then even Sky Pirates and Earth Water summons. But unless you're ready to, don't worry too much. While you're learning the game, don't try to put in every color into a deck. I know it's tempting to build a rainbow deck right off the bat. I know how tempting it is, but it's not 100% necessary. Like,
yeah.
So as you put in more colors, the waters kind of get muddied a little bit and a little bit, and then you have to worry more about color fixing, and you have to worry more about like ways to play those cards. And you don't always want to have to rely on a Tyro to play a good chunk of your deck. So not only should you have a healthy spread of colors, but like you really need to balance those colors out in a good way. Like you can splash a color, you could run a full mono ice deck with 3 Shantotto. You can run a water earth deck with 3 Almateras in it, as long as you have a way of cheating it out.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to make sure that you have a good balance of that you're not just, always at a loss for colors. You don't want to have a dead draw because you can't play those cards.
Yeah, we've all had that moment where you just draw your off-color card and you just sigh because you can't use it. Yeah,
like I even run into that when I'm running Ice Earth. Like it happens even in 2 colors. So you have to be careful about it. And like we've been playing Soiree, which is kind of like a 3-4 color deck.
It's definitely a 4 to 5 color deck.
And I'm sure you could relate when I say that there's been times where I drew into like a Vesphia and a Merald when I need to play Alexa.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, it doesn't happen to me as much, I think, because I think I try to rush out the color fixing fast. I'd imagine most people would, but like you do have those dead draws. It just
especially
happens.
when it comes to playing Madame Adele, and you have like
oh god, if you just somehow don't have Earth, even though most of the deck mine is built around a lot of Earth. Because I've had times where
I've had Elvis and Lexa out, a fire and a wind backup, and it's just like I need to play Madame Adele, but I don't have Earth, despite the fact that all the other ones can be cheated out with Shinju. Just the fact that she's the only one that can't. It's rough.
Yeah, it's painful. So moving on to the next point. So not only should you have a healthy spread of colors in your deck, right? 1 to 2, but balancing those colors is hugely important. Kind of Ty already kind of touched on this by, talking about splashing a color, which usually refers to having less than 30% of your deck be the splashed color. But some decks can easily cheat out multicolor cards or color fix / filter. Some decks don't. So if you're not balancing those colors, make sure you have a consistent or clever way of making those off-color cards useful. So there's a lot of creative ways to do it that are built into the game. We have some examples written down here. And those are like Marsh Ritz, Ursula, and Sophie. You can play Sophie in a totally Earth deck. Never have a water card cheat out Sophie. Realm and basically any monster. Ranpair and the 9-drop Shantotto. Fusoya forward with pretty much any summon, which is cool. The old Fusoya forward, I should say. The lightning one. We have Princess Sarah, which can become any color once. The Cadet Moogles. We have Mannequins, which color fix. I should add Soiree as well in here, which we've been playing more. It's a Soiree. And then we have Golbez with literally any 2-drop.
Any amount of 2-drops.
Yeah, I was going to say it's versatile.
Yeah, because that's versatile. What the most recent Golbez build was. Golbez and Archfiends, and the Archfiends are inherently in 4 different colors, and then Golbez is in the 5th, Lightning. And so building that deck was like a minefield of just like, I got to make sure that I can play stuff if I have it, and I can drop it if I need it.
Yep, definitely. We can move on to the next point here.
Yeah.
In saying that building an inherently anti-meta deck is really hard. And the same thing goes for building an inherently meta deck.
But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try.
Exactly. Well, so oftentimes building an anti-meta deck means you're going to easily counter one deck, but that puts you more often than not in a position to fall into the realm of vulnerability to other decks. Because usually when there's 2 to 3 top decks in a meta, it's very hard to build against one without having issues with another. Pokemon is a game where this is very, very prevalent. But now especially, where we are right now in Final Fantasy, the meta is wide open. Like, it is one of the broadest playing fields we've had in a long time, especially coming off the Stern ban, where 2 or 3 decks were meta and then everything else just suffered. Sure, Sky Pirates and Avalanche and a few other decks were pretty strong coming off that ban, but we are definitely past the point where, we're afraid when we see like the meta decks.
Yeah.
Because everything has a chance again. So build a deck that is just good, and if you play against meta, there's, you might have your good matchup, you might have a bad matchup, but the more you build against one matchup, you get more narrow just like that matchup, and you just kind of shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah. And that really ties into the next point here, which is have answers to major threats, but don't get carried away. So as you were saying, like, there's usually 2 or 3 like meta decks, and there's always going to be some cards that are good against them, but there's kind of, despite the fact that one card could potentially shut off one of these decks, sometimes that doesn't mean you should run it. A good example of this was the Sophie meta before Stern got banned. A card that people largely kind of ignored was Multi-Gemini. Do you remember this? So we saw it a little bit in our local meta, but we had 1 or 2 players running Multi-Gemini, a monster that says powers cannot change, basically. And it's against Sophie. It was amazing. It just completely shut off Sophie. Like, Sophie just didn't have an answer to it unless you could break the monster with Fenrir. However, if that deck ran up against any other deck, if that deck ran up against any non-Sophie deck, Multi-Gemini was just a dead draw. Multi-Gemini did nothing for the deck.
It was 2 CP.
Yeah, exactly. You could pitch it for 2 CP. That was all it could do. So you have to be clever with it. You have to really think, like, the worst a card can be, unless it's light or dark, is it could be pitched for CP. But at the end of the day, it's a dead draw if you're not playing against that deck. So you should find cards that are good against those decks, but don't narrow and like really kind of hone you into just killing that deck. I think a good example of this was the 2-drop Diabolos.
Yeah.
There's Diabolos that was a 2-drop summon, break a forward that has power different from its original power. And so it's a summon. It wasn't a great card, but you could run it at 1 or 2. It was a really good answer to Sophie. It was a really good answer to Stern Leonis. It was just a really good answer card. But the thing is, it wasn't so restrictive, and it didn't completely shut everybody out of like increasing power. And yeah, summons are kind of easier to answer, but because it wasn't as narrow as Multi-Gemini, it was a lot easier to use, and it saw a little bit more application. In those bad matchups, you didn't super mind drawing into it.
Yeah, because you never know when something's power is going to change or someone's going to buff something by 1k to save something else. So, it just kind of, it's a more flexible answer, which is good.
Yeah, and then also on the same point is that like having alternate utility is cool, but like don't let it distract you from your main goal. Because if you're still playing like, for example, like a deck that would run Diabolos, if you're running Storm, you still want to be more focused on storming off. You don't want to have half your deck be anti-meta and then a couple Storm cards. You want to be able to have your gameplay with these cards that can answer threats when you need it. Unless you're running a Swiss Army knife multi-tool deck, which we generally call toolbox decks.
Yep.
You really have to focus on what we said before, your main win condition, your main way to win. Mind you, toolbox decks can work. My early ice builds were very toolboxy, and they generally worked. I consider the deck that I got 4th at Summoner's Cup a toolbox deck. But along with that, and as someone who's played that deck a lot, like, there's issues where you draw the wrong tool and you're like, this card is absolutely useless. Opus 2 Vayne was that card for me a lot, where it's like, this is a really good card against decks that are focused on having high level forwards or high cost forwards. But if I'm playing against Golbez, this card does nothing for me. If I'm playing against this deck, this card does nothing for me. Like, it's...
Yeah, it was an inherently anti-versatile and like 2 other decks.
It won me my game against E-Man, but like that's about it. Like, that's why I've largely cut it, because the thing is, if I'm running against a Soiree deck where everything costs 4, Vayne does nothing against that.
Yep.
If I'm playing against a Rydia Palimporum deck, Vayne does nothing against that. It's just a card that I pitch for 2 CP, or I pay 4 to put out a body. Like, it has no use. So keep in mind, it is good to have these answers. It's good to kind of have 1 or 2 cards that help you answer your local meta or even just the larger meta, but don't let that distract you from the main point of your deck.
Yeah, definitely. Now, that being said, there are some universally good common cards that will fit into a lot of decks that are kind of major threat deterrents. And some of those universally dangerous cards to have are like big board wipes, such as Shantotto or Susano, or even in some cases, the soft wipes like Bahamut Zero. And then, there are also some cards out there that have like action abilities or specials that you can like grip a card to pull off.
Yeah.
Or some other summons, whatever you can think of.
I think a good example of that is we just recorded our top 5 or our 5 least favorite cards, but Kefka. The board wipe Kefka is another really great card to just kind of be able to have. If you're building a crystal-centric deck, Kefka's just nice because if you're fighting Soiree, where they have 4 or 5 back or 4 or 5 forwards, and you can just get rid of 2, 3 of them, it just works.
Yeah, and like one of the ones that we mentioned in that is a card that I hate with every fiber of my being. But it's effective, and it's a static field effect, Sid Randell.
Yeah.
Which just prevents enter the field effects from happening. And it's frustrating to play against because it's so good.
But if you have a slot open in ice, if you just need something, if you notice that a lot of the people you're playing against, like, you're seeing a lot of ETBs. Like, ETBs are always going to be strong in the game, and if you're worried about it and you're in ice, might as well try out like a Sid Rendell, or if you're in fire, like Amaterasu is going to be an important card for you. Not a budget card, but a good one.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that moving on to the next point here in this subcategory is that some decks, if they're optimized extremely well, don't care about threats for a reason or another. Some of them can, for example, recover from board wipes really easily, or they'll reactivate really easily, making dulling irrelevant. Some decks don't mind having forwards bounced or broken. Some punish responses to your actions. And some decks can just entirely avoid all those
much
threats.
Like Sky Pirates. Sky Pirates is definitely a deck that it recovers from board wipes well. You play one Sky Pirate, which plays another one, which plays another one. Like, you have reactivation in Vaughn. You don't really care if your stuff's broken because you can fetch another one. Like, there's a lot of like very optimized decks. You will see a lot of that where there was this thought process of, what if I'm super behind? What if I'm super ahead? Like, how do I keep advantage, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it really, at that rate, is kind of Thanos with the Reality Stone when the Guardians ambush him, and then he just turns the laser pistol into a water gun or a bubble gun or whatever. Like, that kind of thing.
Another deck that kind of does a lot of these things is Black Waltz. Black Waltz is a more modern, popular deck where, if you lose a Black Waltz, it doesn't matter because you just need another Black Waltz out. You have a lot of recursion to get other Black Waltzes back, so you could discard them for effects. If the opponent tries to kill, you can instant speed Black Waltz stuff. Like, there's a good, well-optimized deck will seemingly always have an answer or always have an out. Even if the deck doesn't seem that way on the surface, when you play against it, you will find that this person will, a well-optimized deck will be able to handle kind of what you throw at it.
Yeah, and like, don't feel bad if your deck doesn't have space for answers to those major threats that we mentioned, because sometimes you just have to focus so hard on your win con, right? But also keep in mind where in the deck you might have to make a cut and pull or replace a card for those answers if you find that you're having too much trouble with those big threats.
Yeah.
Are we ready to move on to the last couple points?
So
here?
The next point, or the next big point, is your typical deck structure. So this is like kind of vaguely what a normal deck consists of, and we'll explain the exceptions to these rules as we go through it. There's a lot of outliers, trust us, but like this will be kind of a good starting point for newer players to just kind of get a feel of what most decks will be.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of starter decks built a bit like this just to get you comfortable with a little of everything in the game, to understand how a deck structure on the average side is. And like Ty said, there are a lot of outliers to this that function very differently. But if you're learning the game, or if you want to get, you kind of want to drill those good deck building practices into yourself, this is kind of what you want to work from. Here's your foundation.
So first, and kind of most importantly, is you generally want somewhere between 14 and 18 backups. We talked about curve earlier. Like, even though it, at least from a new player's perspective, it's just like, why would I waste time playing these cards that don't do anything when I can play these cards that will attack? But the whole point of backups is to be able to play everything a lot easier without having to discard cards for them. So you could just incur value over and over as you tap backups for them.
Yeah, it's delayed gratification versus instant gratification. Like, you can get those small little good feelings of, I played a forward, or you can play a couple backups and not feel anything good for a bit, and then, oh wait, now I can play everything. Yeah. You just burst off.
And it depends on the deck on how many backups you want to run. So if you have a lot of stuff that is high cost, if you're worried about, you have a handful of forwards that are 4 or 5 drop that you really need, you generally want to go on the higher end of that. You want to be closer to 16, 17, maybe even 18. But if your deck is a little bit more low to the ground, has a lot of like low cost stuff, or even can cheat out stuff, sometimes you want about 14, 15. And then to talk about an exception to this rule, Water, Earth, Rydia control usually only runs about 8 backups, because you are running Princess Sarah, which helps you search another backup, which puts you at 2 backups. But because all of your forwards are only 2 drop, and you're going to be casting most of your summons for free, there's not a huge need to have these backups. You want more summons to like kind of help facilitate that instead. That is one exception. But if this is like your first deck, if you're just trying to get a feel for the game, or even just like these 2 colors, you probably want to stick anywhere between maybe 14 backups if you have a lot of 2 drops, and then 16, 17, 18 backups if you have more 5, 6, 7 drops, etc.
Yeah, think of it like your economy in a strategy game or a civilization like simulator, where you need infrastructure to do stuff. If you don't have that economy of incoming resources or things to build other things with, you get real jammed up and it feels real sluggy and sluggish.
Yeah. The next point is forwards. So most 90% of decks, putting the opponent to 7 damage is your win condition. And they're going to be your main way of dealing damage, from preventing you from taking damage. Like, forwards are generally important. It's going to be very rare, extremely rare, that you run into a deck that doesn't run forwards. So typically you usually want to run somewhere between 20 and 24 forwards. Once again, one of the exceptions to these rules would be like a very summon focused deck where you're running just mainly key forwards, like back in the day, Doga, Mashari, Rydia.
Yep.
But if you take a deck like Soiree that has a lot of synergies with its forwards, has a kind of very typical game plan, they're usually sitting closer to 23, 24 forwards.
Yep, definitely. Or, with the exception of, what was it, Archfiends, only ran like, I think 10 backups and like almost all forwards. Yeah,
because you were running playset of Rubicon, playset of Cagnazo, playset of 2 different Golbezes. It was 3 depending. Like, there was a lot of your deck was forwards. You were running about 10 backups.
Yep.
Yeah, and then we've even seen Chocobos. Chocobos is another deck that runs.
I was just about to say Chocobos runs about almost all forwards.
Anywhere between 9 and 12 backups, and then you're running 30 something forwards.
I mean, some decks I've seen even run less than that.
Yeah,
they're like 7 or 6 backups.
Yeah, there were some people who would run a playset of Fat Chocobo, a playset of 2-drop Chocobo, playset of the other 2-drop Chocobo, and that's it. And then just all forwards. But, so it can work. Like, forwards are kind of the lifeblood of your deck. It's what's going to usually be your win condition. And especially late game, when you're trying to push for damage, when you're trying to get things to stick on the board, you don't exactly want to keep drawing into backups. You'd rather have forwards out. So, somewhere in the realm of 20 to 24 forwards is probably where you want to be.
Right. I don't know if you already mentioned Ty. I zoned out for a second. But we're recording this pretty late at night. But also keep in mind the forwards are the characters on your field that are most commonly going to be lost due to like abilities, summons, and other removal methods.
Yeah.
So being able to, continually add to your field and replace them is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. And something I feel like I should bring up, because I just realized that we haven't really brought it up on this list before. Don't be scared to run 3 copies of a card. I know, like, the legendary rule is a little daunting. The fact that you can't play like 2 clouds out on the field, it sucks. But you want to have those 3 cards in case something gets removed, in case something dies. And then it also just makes it easier for you to draw it earlier if you're running 3 copies. A big mistake that I see a lot of newer players make is that they'll just like run 1 copy of a lot of good cards. It's like, but you won't be able to find those when you need them. You should be running a lot of 2 and 3 copies of key cards, of cards that will help you win the game.
Or worse, it gets put in damage zone and you never get it.
Yeah, I cannot recommend Soiree more for that entirely, because you're running basically 3 copies of all the forwards, 3 copies of all the backups, etc.
Yep.
But do you want to handle the next part of decks?
Yeah, let's do it. So here the next part is the summons, and you typically want anywhere between roughly 3 and 10 summons, with exceptions, of course. So depending on the deck, you may need to protect your own side of the field, or disrupt the opponent's field, or remove something from their side, remove a combo piece or whatever, or perform some sort of combo of your own. And summons are a good way to do this, but only a few decks in the top tier will ever use a lot of them. Obviously, we have stuff like Radiant Palamporum or the Doga-centric stuff. Currently, mono water summons is becoming a thing again. Folka went from like a $3 card to like 14 because they're impossible to get now because everyone wants to play Folka. So, for the most part, you need to have summons as utility and combat tricks, but don't get carried away making your deck too much about summons without having, other substance to it.
Yeah.
And then the last part here is monsters. And this part is probably the most variable because some decks don't include them at all. And some decks make real good use of like 1 or 2 monsters, with exception of the 1 or 2 decks out there that play almost all monsters or make heavy use of monsters. So you're going to run probably 0 to 5 monsters. More often than not, it's going to be that 0, because monsters are often disregarded unless they serve a very strong or particular purpose. Their role is raw utility and will be left out of most decks just because they're so slow, or they're not effective enough, or they just don't fit the role as well as something else does. But if they are included, they're included for a very good, distinct reason.
Yeah.
So, just consider monsters, but sometimes, most of the time, actually, what you'll do is just consider them and say, nah, something else is better.
I think a very good example of this is the newest monster that we've seen a lot, Byblos. So Byblos is a 2-drop monster. Whenever the opponent discards a card, you get to dull and freeze a forward they control, which is a good effect. And then at damage 3, he could become a forward at any time. And then when he attacks, the opponent discards a card, which then leads to his other effect to make them, which allows you to dull and freeze a forward. And Byblos is a good card. He's a really good card. He's really great in discard when you get to make the opponent discard 2 and then dull and freeze 2. Like, he's very strong. But the thing is, if you're running like a mono ice, just a mono ice deck that runs like no discard, or even like an Ice Earth deck that's not running like any, or like maybe 1 discard card, Byblos isn't going to be worth it. Because even though he can animate and become a forward, even though his first effect's good, it's not doing a lot to the game plan of your deck. It's just he's just kind of there. Yeah, so you put it very well when you said like, they need to be there for a specific reason. Like, you don't just run a monster because you can. Like, it's just going to bog down your deck.
Yeah. Monsters are such a really interesting thing when they got added to the game, that like everybody freaked out about them changing the game so much, and they only did for a little while.
We talked earlier about like a toolbox. Imagine kind of monsters as that one tool that like comes up occasionally. Like, it's that one that's kind of included in the kit that you don't really care about and you don't really think about until you desperately need it, or until you finally get that thing that actually uses it, because like monsters, like for example, my old Earth Ice ran the 2 versions of Flans, and they were entirely just for a mana engine that now isn't very good. But even in modern mono ice decks, the only monster that you're really running is like Scale Toad. or Biblos. YKT63 is also a really good card, but like you only run them for a very specific instance. Don't feel the need to just throw in monsters or take a big monster that looks cool. Like you need to have a very specific reason for them to be there.
Yeah, the downside is that, or I guess the upside, however you want to take it, is that monsters are hard to remove because most people don't expect monsters.
Yeah.
So there are pros and cons to running them, but make sure the pros outweigh the cons, or at least don't just break even, because if you're breaking even, there's something of better value out there.
And as of right now in Opus 16, not to date this episode, we don't really have a monster that just like wins you the game. We've seen some very powerful forwards like Sophie or Doga or any of those, or even some very powerful backups like Shantotto, but we haven't seen a monster take that slot of that's an insanely good card. This card will be a run in decks. Like it just hasn't happened.
I was going to say we also haven't seen a light or dark monster, but now that's objectively false with Twin Tanya.
Kind of.
Yeah, it doesn't have the official monster label on it, but like the card text says it's a monster, so you could argue.
Yeah.
And we have some exceptions to the above rules listed here, but I think we already mentioned like most of them.
Yeah. To run through them again really quick. Doga Sophie and Earthwater Rydia ran a lot of summons. Same with the new kind of mono water summons deck. Chocobos was an almost entirely forwards deck. There was also, here's a throwback, a deck called Strongest Sword that ran 1 backup, 1 summon, and 48 forwards.
Yep.
It was a Golbez deck. We already kind of mentioned Rydia Palamporum, very highly summon focused. Mill decks will be a lot of summons and backups just to make sure that you can always play stuff so you can just lay your opponent. And then Shikaris and Golbez decks are very forward heavy, yeah.
And then the last detail here that we have, and we've done another episode on this in the past, but we could probably revisit it at some point in the future, is that play styles. I originally read this as play styles because I'm tired and for some reason my brain defaulted to the Greek pronunciation of things. Plastyles. Play styles factor in somewhat, but in terms of strictly deck building, these are common standard practices. So once you gain experience and have more understanding of the game, you'll be able to edit and build decks with more ease, more streamlining, and build outside the standards that we've described here. But until then, kind of just keep these concepts in the back of your mind. And don't be afraid to net deck. Analyzing builds of tournament winners or decks from large scale or major events might give you a superior insight into the meta of the time, and help you make decisions for a deck, or like what to build or what you might enjoy, or even what you'll face, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Yeah, if you're playing like only casuals, then whatever makes you happy. Like, we're podcasters, not cops, kind of like Ty already said. But
yeah, I 100% agree. Like I mentioned earlier in this episode, like don't be scared to get constructive criticism. The other big thing, kind of outside of the scope of deck building, is like don't feel afraid to net deck. You may get some, jeers for it, but net decking is a really great way to understand why a deck works, why a deck is good. And sometimes, like, you will look at a deck on FF Decks and you'll say, how did this win? Why did this win? What is this deck? This is just 50 cards. And then you run it and you're like, oh, then you can kind of understand a little bit more the thought processes that went into it. You get to kind of say, oh, that's why this card is here. It's like, why wouldn't you run this over this? And then you play it and you're like, oh, because this works extremely well with this other card. Like I've been net decking ever since I started playing this game. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but something I really like to do is I don't like building decks. I like taking decks and then working with them and tinkering with them and changing them and like trying to fit them to our local meta.
Yeah, you're not an engineer, you're a technician.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not an engineer, I'm a technician. And like, don't be scared to do that because that'll inspire your other decks. That'll inspire you to build other stuff. Like always start with a baseline, even if it means just copying something for now.
Yeah, I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of the few games out there that like actually laughs at people for net decking. And there are very rare exceptions where, you'll look at a tournament and be like, why did this win? And then the answer is because they had good matchups.
Yeah.
But like, By and large, yeah, just looking at those decks are going to give you a lot of insight, and playing with them will give you a lot of knowledge and experience, not only with the deck, but the game in general, to see how things work, where things are, that sort of thing. And mirror matches also. Play mirror matches if you can.
Yeah.
That's something we didn't mention a lot here, but play mirror matches, because those give you a lot of insight as well on how the deck works, where it falters, where it's good or bad, especially against itself, which is something I hadn't really considered until we started recording. But here we are.
Yeah, mirror matches are always nice if you can. Like, you don't expect everybody to build a deck just for you, but it's nice.
I mean, it helps when decks are cheaper. Like, we built Soiree pretty cheap and easy. We happen to have everything, so that Soiree mirror, dude. Oh
yeah. But all right, that's kind of the rough of it. If you follow this guide exactly, we're not going to promise that you're going to win every game, but we just wanted to kind of give you a jumping off point.
Yeah, you'll get to Gold League against the hard AI, but can't promise you anything more than that.
Yeah, just don't hop into rank.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess now we can just kind of end Fix It Friday forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, I know you guys enjoyed it, we enjoyed it, but like, what's the point now? We recorded this episode, this guide, and what's the point? Everybody who watches is going to become a pro, and the scene is going to explode and go nuclear. It's going to be huge, and we'll be left on the wayside. Just like a casual credit in the background.
Yeah, we'll lose all. We're giving you the key to our failure. Just follow this advice, and you'll never need Fix It Friday again.
Exactly. Until we get to that point, we'll keep putting out episodes, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yep. Peace. Bye.